Welcome to the New Canaan Museum and Historical Society. I'm Nancy Geary, the Executive Director, and I'm honored to present Dede Bartlett's discussion, Celebrating the Women in Your Family. I want to thank Staying Put in New Canaan, our partner in sponsoring this program. Barb Achenbaum, who is here with us today, and her team work tirelessly on behalf of the seniors in New Canaan, and the museum is always pleased when we can find ways to collaborate on programs with them. I also want to thank Bob Doran and NCTV 79 for making it possible to bring this presentation into your home. This is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. To honor this important date, the New Canaan Museum and Historical Society and NCTV 79 are presenting Women Leaders of New Canaan, Celebrating the Legacy of the 19th Amendment. This series showcases 19 extraordinary women in New Canaan whose lives and work have shaped and inspired their community. And it goes without saying that Dede Bartlett is one of these amazing women. A former Fortune 25 executive with Mobil Oil Corporation and Philip Morris Company, Dede is co-chair of the New Canaan Domestic Violence Partnership and a director of Legal Momentum, the Women's Legal Defense and Education Fund. She was honored for her work helping survivors of domestic violence with a Women Who Make a Difference Award from the International Women's Forum. She co-chairs the Jim and Dede Bartlett Foundation and is the author of a 3-volume memoir, Discovering My Lost Family, The Unexpected Journey of an American Woman. We're thrilled to have her here today to share stories of the remarkable women in her own life and to help us all learn how to celebrate the women in our own families. There will be plenty of time for questions at the end of Dede's talk, so feel free to text anything that you would like me to ask on your behalf. My number is 617-733-5474. Again, thank you for participating, and welcome to Dede Bartlett.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Barb. And thank you, Bob and Scott, for the technical work that makes all of this possible. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today and be with you in spirit as you watch this program. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about how you can celebrate the amazing women in your families and why their stories are so important today. As Nancy said, this program is part of the museum's celebration of the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. And this celebration couldn't come at a more extraordinary moment. Our nation has just elected its first woman vice president, Kamala Harris. An amazing achievement that would not have been possible without the 19th Amendment and all the work that came after. With all the turmoil this year, it's easy to forget how important the 19th Amendment was. Before the 19th Amendment, women in this country had no legal rights. Think of that. No legal rights. If she were married, she was the property of her husband. If she were single and never married, she was the property of her nearest male relative. Think about your great-grandmother. When she married, she became the property of her husband. If she had any money, that money became his. If he drank up her dowry or gambled away her inheritance, there was nothing she could do about it. In fact, some of the organizations that were formed in the late 19th century to change things and were precursors in the passage of the 19th Amendment were organizations formed by women, like the Women's Christians Temperance Union, that their goal was to outlaw alcohol because they saw the devastating effects on their families, their children, and their income. Your great-grandmother before 1920 could not own land. She could not own a house, and she certainly could not own a business. If she were in a troubled marriage, she had a very difficult time getting a divorce. Even if she could get a divorce, she lost control of her children. The only exception to this awful situation were widows. They could own land, and they could control their money. As a result, not surprisingly, many financially secure women chose to remain single. My sixth great-grandmother was one of those women. Her name was Anne Waddell. She was a widow and was one of the wealthiest women, one of the wealthiest people in the American colonies in 1762. As a matter of fact, when the New York Society Library was formed, which was a precursor of the Library of Congress and one of the oldest institutions in the United States, when it was formed, Anne Waddell was the only woman trustee in the library in 1762 when King George III granted it a royal charter, and she signed her name Anne Waddell, widow. That was her title. The 19th Amendment wasn't perfect. There was a lot of things wrong with it. A lot of work had to be done. A lot of work is still being done. But it dramatically improved women's lives. It paved the way for broader women's rights. And it allowed women to own property and businesses and manage their financial affairs, and it ultimately led to greater reproductive rights. So, think back about the incredible women in your families and how you want to tell their stories, especially some of those women who lived before the 19th Amendment. And as you think about memorializing them and you have questions, as I go through some of my stories, text Nancy at the number she gave you with a question we can discuss during the Q&A. So, let me illustrate some ways to tell the stories of your women in your families by telling you some of the stories of the women in my family. This is a composite picture of 9 of the women in my family, ranging from my third great-grandmother, Sarah, who was born in 1812, to my mother, Emily, who died in 2000. Almost 200 years of rather extraordinary women. They lived in hard times, and they taught me a great deal about resilience. In the interest of time, I'm only going to highlight 4 of them. And as I do, think about the stories you want to tell about the women in your families and include some of the elements that I'm going to describe to you. Number 1, the times and places in which she lived. 2, what she overcame. 3, remember, genealogy is very boring, but sex sells. So be sure to include all the scandals. Your family will love it. Number 4, analyze their legacy. And number 5, if you're writing and scrapbooking and journaling and videotaping, show lots and lots of pictures. So, let's meet the family. let me introduce you to my third great-grandmother, Sarah Polimus Taylor. Sarah was born in 1812 near Poughkeepsie, New York. She was an elegant, high-born lady, and her husband was the grandson of one of the wealthiest landowners in New York State. This picture was taken when Sarah was about 35 years old, and it was taken from a daguerreotype, which was one of the earliest types of photograph, very expensive. Only the wealthy could afford to have their portraits taken with this expensive new technology. But Sarah's genteel life was shattered when her mother committed suicide because of a terribly painful disease for which there was no cure. Shortly thereafter, her only child, George, began an affair with the German immigrant servant girl, Dorothea, who later became my great-great-grandmother. The picture of Dorothea in that lace cap, Dorothea looks kind of forbidding and foreboding. I think I would too if I'd had 11 children under the circumstances that Dorothea went through. Well, as things happened, Dorothea became pregnant. Sarah threw her out of the house. No, this is not a soap opera. This is real. And the baby was born in a cold water tenement on the Lower East Side where 50 families shared a privy. Flash forward 200 years later, that same real estate in New York City is the most expensive real estate in the entire city. Times change in peculiar ways. Both those scandals were the talk of New York in 1853. Sarah was humiliated. She lived at a time when America's demographics were changing rapidly, much like we are going through today. The old line aristocrats did not know what to make of these great unwashed hordes who were coming in from Ireland, Germany, later from Italy, and from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were completely at a loss. But Sarah's great strength was her ability to overcome the deep class divisions of her time. And before her death, she was able to reunite her bitterly divided family. She lived to smile upon 5 grandchildren, and her obelisk in the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn testifies to her family's love and her ability to adapt to changing times. I see lessons and lessons and lessons here. So, moving on to a different part of the country and a different resilient woman, I'd like you to meet Sally, my great-great-grandmother from the South, another lady of enormous resilience. This is not a very good picture of Sally, but alas, it's the only one we have. And when you are facing similar situations, you will be delighted to at least have one picture, grainy as it may be. Sally was the daughter of 2 of the oldest families on the Delmarva Peninsula. The Delmarva Peninsula is that peninsula south of Washington, D.C., that comprises the entire state of Delaware. We all know where Delaware is today. And 9 counties of Maryland and 2 counties of Virginia. But Sally's privileged life came to an end when her young husband suddenly died. She found herself widowed at 24, with 2 children under the age of 4, and pregnant with a 3rd. Sally had to figure out very quickly how to survive against overwhelming odds. And what she did was remarkable for her time then, in the 1840s, and for now. she decided to run her deceased husband's shipping business, something unheard of in 1844. It probably would be equally unheard of today, certainly for a woman who was 7 months pregnant with 2 tiny kids at home. But Sally was undaunted, and despite the prohibitions of women at sea and in the seafaring and shipbuilding business, she ran the business so well that during the Civil War, she supported 3 daughters, their 3 husbands, and 11 grandchildren, 17 members of her family, with the proceeds of that business during a time in those border states when thousands were dying, millions were impoverished, a war that killed 750,000 Americans, a crisis of unheard of proportions. Sally was tough, and she fought hard to save her family. Her grandson asked her many years later what her secret to survival was, and Sally, in true tough fashion, said, "Simple, I paid off both sides." Well, that's one way to do it. And now I'd like you to meet my grandmother, Anna. Anna was from Delaware, the daughter of a gentleman farmer. Anna was frustrated with the limitations imposed on women, and she was determined from an early age to have her own way. However, the institutions were not hospitable to that. At boarding school, she fell in love with a student who was studying for the ministry, and she wanted to marry him. However, her father had other ideas. He had already chosen a husband for her. And as a matter of fact, that man had already built Anna a house for them to live in. But Anna refused to marry this man, and when she did, her father disowned her. This was a very dangerous situation for a young woman in 1906. Very difficult for young women back then to become financially independent and override the wishes of family. Fortunately, Anna had a very strong aunt who came to her rescue and paid for the wedding. But Anna didn't stop there with daring do. During the 1918 influenza epidemic, Anna risked her life to help the suffering. Like COVID, there was no cure for the flu. It ended up killing 50 million people around the world, including 675,000 Americans in every state of the Union, even tiny, remote villages in Alaska. Does this sound familiar? Anna helped the sick with the only remedies available then: whiskey, quinine, and the miracle drug aspirin. When she got up in the pulpit of her husband's church, she was heard to announce, "God hates a coward." I often wonder what the reaction might have been in those conservative towns on the Delmarva. Anna was determined to expand the limits of what women could do, and she joined organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union that helped pass the 19th Amendment. She believed fervently in the equality of women, and she would have been amazed at what women can do today, and I think she would have been a little bit jealous. And last, I'd like you to meet my mom. My mother's name was Emily, and she was brilliant. But she was completely out of place in the conservative towns of the Delmarva, where life revolved around my grandfather's very strict Methodist church and where dancing and card playing were forbidden. Emily's world, like many of her predecessors, came crashing down when she was 12 and her mother, Anna, died. Within a year, her father had remarried a divorced woman, been expelled from the Methodist church, and the family was forced to flee town. To make matters worse, life with her tyrannical stepmother was dreadful. Emily graduated from high school at age 15 with the highest grades recorded in the state of Delaware. But her father refused to send her to college. Happily, she achieved that goal 30 years later when she graduated with honors with a double major in English and mathematics from New York University at age 45. Not much held my mama back. Instead, at age 15, she was sent to finishing school, but she secretly took secretarial courses at a local technical college, which was her salvation. She was 17 years old when she started work as a secretary at an insurance company in Wilmington, Delaware, working 6.5 days a week. It was 1 week before the stock market crashed in 1929. She knew no one, so she stayed at the YWCA and saved every penny she could. Like many of her generation, she survived the Great Depression when 25% of Americans were unemployed. The parallels with today's economic crisis are chilling. She learned self-reliance and frugality, lessons which lasted a lifetime. When she and my dad married in June of 1940, my grandfather said, "Well, you might as well marry. France has fallen." Like so many, he felt the world had ended. As I said, my mom was part of the greatest generation, and when I asked her years later how she endured so many hardships, she said she learned that nothing lasts forever. Such wise advice. The women who came before us can teach us so much. I am sure the women in your families have taught you so much, and their lessons should be and need to be preserved. They lived through wars, they lived through plagues, they lived through depressions, the loss of husbands, and the devastating loss of children. We need their inspirational stories to help our families survive the hard times today. We need their examples to keep going when we feel discouraged and frustrated and lonely and lost. So there are a number of ways for you to record your heroine stories. I'm going to mention a few. I'm sure you can think of others, but this will get you going. And I think as we approach the holidays, it is a terrific time to consider this very important project. You certainly can write books. I have written, as Nancy mentioned, a trilogy of my family, my father's family in the West Indies, the other half of his family in New York City, and my mother's family in the South. And for those of you who have questions on how to start writing books, putting them together, I'd be delighted to discuss that separately. It really isn't that hard. and it really is a lot of fun. I think that the research is the part that captivates me and that I can fall in love with. Number 2, those scrapbooks of yours, please update them, but update them in the following way. Label all the photographs. We all know that there are photos in places where we just don't know who these people are. Find who they are. Your descendants will bless you for this. But when you're doing your scrapbooking, be sure to include memorabilia, highlights of the times, interesting pieces from local newspapers, give context, ticket stubs, all sorts of memorabilia can be thrown in those albums that make them more than just a recitation of one picture after another. They can and they should tell a story. And most important, be sure to use archival paper. You know that sticky stuff we all started using about 30 years ago, 20 years ago? Not so good. Invest in some archival paper. It's well worth it, and it will preserve your very special memories. Number 3, oral history. I am a huge believer in oral history. That not only preserves your voice and your children's voices, it captures your family's history in a very special way. There's a great project that started about 15 years ago called the National Oral History Project. It's fascinating. Please Google it, check it out. There's all sorts of nifty ideas there. They will inspire you and get you going. Number 4, have your grandchildren and your children videotape you telling the stories. They know the technology. They can do that. You can tell the stories. They ask the questions. It's a terrific holiday project that can be very special and bring the families together. A few days ago, I was with my younger granddaughter, Charlotte, and we had one of these grandchild conversations in which Charlotte said to me, "Gigi," that's my grandma name, "are there witches?" So we had a wonderful opportunity to talk about witches and smart women over the centuries and some of the smart women in the family, and it was very special. That's the kind of thing you want to get to. Number 5, write your own story. The library here in New Canaan has a terrific writing workshop to get you started. Before I wrote a word on any of these books, I took their writing workshop course. It was an eye-opener. It was a gentle lead you by the path down this wonderful way of recording stories and how to do it. Well worth the time and a terrific way to get started. Number 6, all those CDs and films and videos that are lying in the attic, in cardboard boxes and wherever, get them out. Gather them together. Send them to, there's lots of services that will digitize them on thumb drives. Send those to family members. They are absolutely of no use in the format they're in. I know, we've all got them. But in digitizing them, you preserve them in a decent format, in a good format, in a more permanent format for people to use thereafter. Number 7, I am a big believer on family recipes. Last year, when I spoke here at the Historical Society, some of you may remember I talked about a wonderful little box of recipes that my mother-in-law had created, in which existed some recipes for some fabulous cookies that she used to make our children when they were little. I gave our daughter Katie that box of Grandma's recipes for Christmas last year, and it now has pride of place in her kitchen. You can take that same idea, you can create a loose leaf book out of it or something more elaborate, and you can include pictures of the women and men who created the wonderful recipes that are in your family. At the end of every one of my books, I always have family recipes. It makes the people come alive in a very special way. And number 8, this holiday season will be like no other. Some of us will be Zooming our dearest relatives, dearest family, because we can't be with them during the holidays. Let me make a suggestion. Take out those wonderful quilts that your ancestors made, that your grandmother made, those tablecloths. Display them. And during the Zoom call, show the family these wonderful, wonderful pieces and tell a story about them. And it becomes a living celebration. It becomes a very special, historic celebration, enables you to tell, once again, some fabulous stories about the women in your family, because these are special women's arts. So these are a few suggestions of ways to capture some of the special memories of the women in your family. And I think I'll take a pause now. I have some other thoughts, but I want to pause for perhaps some questions that have come in. I know Nancy and Barb have already a few questions, so I'll pause now, wait to hear from you, and then I'll come back.
Okay, we do have some questions coming in for you, Dede. Thank you. This person sent a lot. Okay, what do you see as the most important issue to promote women's rights today?
The most important issue to promote women's rights today. I'd have to say education. I'd have to say education because people have to understand what still needs to be done so that all of our people can achieve all of their potential. We have legislated a great deal, but we still have some attitudinal adjustments that need to be made. We would not have had a Me Too, a very thriving Me Too movement, if we hadn't had the need to make some major attitude adjustments to behaviors. So I would have to say education on the potential for what all people can do, not just women, but all people, because I see women's rights as civil rights and human rights as women's rights.
Well, this is actually a perfect follow-up to that question. This is from Scott Herr, the new minister at the Presbyterian Church. What is the most important thing you feel men can do to encourage and support the women in our lives?
Well, coming from Scott, who is a priceless man and such a champion of women and women's rights, and I think that also the fact that Scott has 3 sons and a daughter means that he's, and a terrific wife, means that he's already been sensitized to a number of issues. I would say that understanding that there are no barriers to what women can do, as there are no barriers to what men can do. We each come with that slate of what our innate strengths are and there shouldn't be limits on that. And that, frankly, is the way we would hope to raise all of our children. And men can and should be, and all of us who are married to great guys know that there are no preconceived expectations of it should be this way because it's been that way for 1,000 years.
Okay, this is, what advice would you give to our daughters, young women, as they're starting out in their careers?
Advice in starting out your careers. Oh, do lots of different things. Do lots of things. Have your horizons as open as possible. And I say that because you'll be working a very, very, very long time. And frankly, for the rest of your life. And you will end up having probably at least 10 to 15 different careers. And it is important to understand what you like and what you don't like. And the only way you figure out what you like and what you don't like is by testing yourself in different situations and giving yourself the opportunity to explore those different situations.
I've got a question. We're getting back to the research now that you did, yes. And what phenomenal and interesting women you had, and so resilient in your family. The question is, while you were doing your research, which was so extensive, did you ever come across anything so troubling that it made you wish maybe that you hadn't started the process?
I came across a number of troubling things. And as those of you who have done research in family can probably attest, you too have come across troubling things. For me, the troubling discovery was learning that a revered patriarch of the family was not only a slave owner, as were, frankly, most Americans of any means in the 17th and 18th and early 19th century. That does not excuse it, that's just the way it was. But the fact that this patriarch of the family was also most probably a slave trader. And that was exceptionally hard for me. I struggled with that as I was writing one of my books. And I struggle with that knowing that I will need to try to help the younger members of my family understand what that legacy is. And so in the last book that I've just finished writing, I wrote a piece that I would like to just read to you because it was from the heart, and this is the last book that I have written called The Things They Loved, A History of Our Family in 12 Objects. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But I wrote, we cannot change the past. We cannot undo the sufferings some of our ancestors endured or caused. One of my ancestors was also a remarkable enslaved woman in the Caribbean who raised and supported 3 generations of her family through amazing hardship. And I have her free papers to attest to it, which is a very dramatic and wonderful discovery. But I wrote, we cannot undo those sufferings, but we can learn from the past. And this, I think, is the most important thing as we go forward. And be aware of the harm that was done, and by committing not to do more harm. The phrase that Mahatma Gandhi wrote that really I try to live by in these days when we're all coming to a national reckoning over division and race in this country is be the change that you want to see in the world. And that, to me, is fundamentally important.
Okay, we have a question just in. Did you use online resources like Ancestry.com to help you find your family history? If you don't have a lot of relatives still living, what are other methods of finding your family?
Yes, I used Ancestry. Many times I used Ancestry. Ancestry has its limitations. I was able to also tap into people who had done some very unique research that would not have been available on Ancestry. For example, I learned about my enslaved fourth great grandmother because of some remarkable research that was done in St. Croix by a historian there who had compiled genealogies using data from Copenhagen and from Washington and from Salt Lake prior to the advent of Ancestry. And so we were able to find slave records and shipment records that were just remarkable. So I am the last member of all of my families. I have no aunts or uncles. I have no cousins. So I had no one to reach out to for stories and additional work. So I had to rely on other sources. And when I began this work, literally 30 plus years ago, Ancestry didn't exist. Online sources didn't exist. So I had to do some digging on my own. And I also was very fortunate for each of my 3 books, one in New York, one in the Delmarva in Maryland and Delaware, and one in St. Croix. I hired local genealogists in each place who were very familiar with the local archives, who could literally do the walking through the archives that I could not do.
We have another question that I think is interesting. How do you think your women ancestors would feel about the ways you portrayed them?
I love that. I love that. I've often had a pipe dream of getting all 9 of them together in a room and how they would like that and if they would actually talk to one another. I have a feeling that some of them wouldn't. I have a feeling that some of them would be a little, but I have a feeling that some of them would. I have enough sort of spiritual, my Crucian ancestors would call it juju, to believe that I think they're kind of happy with this. When I was writing the St. Croix book, they would not let me sleep until I had finished that book. They were with me all the time. So, yeah, but I don't know that they would all get along. I don't think they would. But I think that they would feel they've been given some due.
Right.
Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question?
I think we have time for one more.
You know, I think that you have a wonderful family history. You've got some wonderful resources in terms of the research.
Right.
And my parents, they've moved 5 times. There aren't too many photos left in our family. What do you recommend for people who don't have all that photographic information? How can they tell their family story?
You know, that's a great question, and it's an important one because a lot of folks don't have this. When I talk to friends whose families have perished in the Holocaust, okay, they'll say to me, but there's no way I could do anything like what you're doing, Dede. But there is. There is, in a way. It's part of the feeling when you're doing genealogical research, you get a half a loaf or a quarter of a loaf, and you've got to be very pleased with what you can do with that. And by that, I mean getting your DNA tested. So I'll give you a perfect example. My mother's family in Delaware and Maryland were Huguenots. Okay, their name was Cleaver. but it wasn't their real name when they came from France. I do not even know what their real name was. I do not know when they left France because the Huguenots were being persecuted. I do not know anything about their journey. They are ciphers, except for the fact that when my DNA was analyzed, I could find specifically where in France that family is from. So I knew that they were from Poitiers and New Rochelle, and I could develop a narrative based on historical records of what happened to the Huguenots who survived the persecutions and the assassinations from those places, and then moved, because of the historical record there, then moved to England, and then moved to the United States. So that is one way to do it. Would I love to know what the real family name is? Sure. Would I love to have a picture? Oh, that would be heavenly. But I'm close enough to knowing that that is my land. That's my soil. I can grab that. And I'm comfortable with that. Yeah.
That actually leads into this next question. Doing family research is fun, but it's frustrating. How do you deal with the fact that you may never have answers to all the questions that come up?
Yeah. You you have to be thankful for what you can get. It is frustrating. You will always have questions, and who knows? There may be a time where there will be time where perhaps the data will come. You can even list the questions, as I have in some of my books. We do not know now. Does that mean we will never know? Not likely, but there's a possibility. So the advances that we can make now are extraordinary. When my mother set out to do research on her family 50 years ago and 40 years ago, it's amazing she could do what she could do pre-internet, pre-computer, going through halls of records in small towns in Delaware and Maryland, just astonishing. But she was able to do that. And but she knew she could only get so much. I was able to extend it, but look at what technology has done. Perhaps my grandchildren can take it farther back. We haven't yet seen the end of the story. And I think that's the thing that's where there's such great hope. One of the happy things from this research is that I mentioned earlier that I have no relatives. Through this research, I discovered several second cousins, and we had a reunion in Montana last fall, and it was such fun. And we just had a Zoom call last year, and they all want to come east when the COVID restrictions are over, and we can go through and we can do a family history tour, perhaps in 21. So that's fun. Once again, the discoveries are exciting and enriching.
Very inspiring.
Yes.
I think this has to be the last question.
All right.
But your family is extraordinary, clearly, as are you. For those that the women in their families may have had simpler accomplishments, how do you celebrate that?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and believe me, not every woman in my family is a barn burner. There are lots of nice, quiet ladies who did not do the extraordinary things that I've recounted here today, and they have great value. I highlight them in my book because I think that the achievements of women who kept their families together in times of such peril, who survived at a time when the average woman had 5 or 6 or 7 children and lost 2 or 3 of them in childhood. How she managed absolutely stuns me. Her strength of character is stunning. I have a tablecloth from my great-great-grandmother that took over a year to make, working 20 hours a week. It took over a year to make. Those are the quiet, wonderful arts of women who kept their families together, who persevered, who had tough times, but it didn't stop them. They kept going. And I highlight them in my books, and I honor them. Our lives are immeasurably easier today than theirs were, and I take great celebration in that. So I have one last point that I want to leave you with, because, and that's the segue here, we're the memory keepers, often the very last generation that knows the stories. And during the lockdown this past spring, I wrote a small companion book to my family trilogy, the one I've just shown you, called The Things They Loved, A History of Our Family in 12 Objects. And when I finished the book, I discovered something extraordinary that I want to share with you and that I think may interest you. I started writing this book for my children, Katie and Jay, and my grandchildren, Alexandra and Charlotte. But by the time I was finished, I realized I had also written the book for myself. As I was writing for my family, I was finding inspiration in the lives of my forebears. And as I was writing for my family, I was finding comfort in a time of anxiety and grief. And as I was writing for my family, I was becoming stronger and more at peace every day. So as you tell your stories, I hope you find the same inspiration and strength and healing power that I did. And I wish you well, and I thank you so much, Nancy and Barb, and please everyone, stay safe and God bless.